Welcome. My name is James Quintero. I lead the Taxpayer Protection Project at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And last week, I had the privilege of celebrating 16 years at the foundation. I have absolutely, thank you. I think just about everyone, including myself, enjoys that point except the Texas Municipal League. So it's been an absolute thrill of a lifetime to be at this place, watch it grow, watch it prosper. Today, I want to do something a little different than our panels in the past. I want to take a little bit of time to celebrate those things that Texas does well. So welcome to the good life, fighting for affordability, opportunity, and prosperity in Texas. And of course, we're going to talk about some of the challenges a little later on, but I do want to open up with some of the really good things that I think Texas does well. And in that regard, I was looking over some numbers, some data, to find out what is the latest and greatest about the Lone Star State. And come to find out, the Texas Workforce Commission had this headline today: Texas job growth surged in February. We actually outpaced the rest of the nation in job growth for the month of February. And in fact, we've had job growth in 44 of the last 46 months. And of course, all of those jobs are coming because people are coming, right? And in fact, this statistic blew me away. From 2000 to 2022, the state gained over 9 million new residents. That's about 365,000 new people added every single year. And just to build on that a little bit more, from 2020 to 2023, at least 164 companies relocated to Texas and now call the Lone Star State home. So to help me find out why all of these good things are happening, I have an absolute panel of rock stars that have decided to join me, and I'm so thankful for their help. These are some of the finest conservative warriors in the movement, and we are privileged to have them. So please help me welcome Senator Middleton, Nicole Nosek, and Chance Weldon. They are terrific. And so, panel, if you would, Senator, I want to start off with you. What is it exactly about the Lone Star State that is drawing these just masses of people every single year, which is contributing to all sorts of economic growth and employment creation?
Well, Texas is different than every other state, right? I mean, we have the Alamo. We fought for our freedoms here. We know the value of those God-granted freedoms, and that isn't free, actually. It takes a lot of sacrifice, and the price of that is eternal vigilance. I think it's actually kind of ironic that, 20, 30 years ago, we were in the early 90s, back when California was Republican, we were trying to be more like them. And now everyone's fleeing California to Texas. Why? Because of the bad government decisions that they're making. So, we've got one of the really best ways, I think, to do that is let people keep more of their own money in their own pocket, right? Because government doesn't know how to run your life better than you do. Government does not know how to run your business better than you do. And that's really what Texas exceptionalism is about.
And Senator, just to build on that point, the legislature, of course, took some big action last session to give people their money back. I wonder if you could just talk about what that was.
So it was the largest property tax relief package in history, $18 billion. And I always get asked the question, well, why is it so hard to get that done? Well, one of the reasons, unfortunately, is your own tax dollars are being spent on Austin lobbyists that live and work here in Austin, certainly don't represent your community's values, to lobby against property tax relief and reform, right? So your own dollars are being used against you, and not just taxpayers, but parents as well. I mean, we saw it this session with school choice. The taxpayer-funded lobbyists loaded up the committees, and it's just fundamentally unfair, right? I remember in 2017, the last time we had a big school choice push before this session, sitting there in committee and watching parents that were there because they wanted more opportunity for their kids, and they took time off work. They made that sacrifice to be there. They weren't being paid to be there, and then they were having to go up against lobbyists that were using their own school tax dollars to lobby against them. That's wrong. That's forced speech is what that is, and you're having to pay for speech you don't agree with. And we don't have to shop at Target, if we don't like it. We don't have to shop at HEB, but if you don't like what the taxpayer-funded lobbyists are lobbying against or for, quit paying your property taxes and someone takes your house, your business. It's not the same.
So, Senator, is it fair to say that in the absence of taxpayer-funded lobbying, we as taxpayers may have seen an even bigger tax cut?
Yes. The biggest obstacle to conservative legislation is actually, of course, Democrats and taxpayer-funded lobbyists that are helping the Democrats, right? And the not-so-secret secret is that when we get the votes to pass school choice, we will also have the votes to pass the ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying.
Something to celebrate indeed. Nicole, you and I share something of a secret. We are both California economic refugees. I came here about 30 years ago. You here within the last couple of years. Can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to the Lone Star State and some of the endeavors that you're now engaged with?
Yeah, thank you, and I'm really honored to be here, James. I mean, the work that you do and the work that this organization does, it really is an honor being here, so thank you. We've been here, my husband and I were here for about 5 years, but I became especially interested in land use by seeing how bad land use and the dealing of land use was in California. And I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. About 8-9 years ago, I was a paralegal, working about 45, 50 hours a week, studying to go to law school, and making about $48,000. And $48,000 is a pretty decent salary. Well, in California, that meant that I was in a 3-bedroom apartment. There was a family with a baby in one of the rooms. Second room was a young tech professional, and I was in the third room, and after paying rent and groceries, consistently I had about $1,000 in my bank account every month. And that was me doing good. And so I took a step back and I thought, how is a state that claims to care about its middle class and poor creating a system where young professionals like myself are living in a situation like that, where the concept of home ownership was far outside of reach? And by the way, what we're seeing today is the lack of free market policies. The lack of allowing people to build has created a situation where about 50% of young people from 18 to 32 live with their family not because they want to. They live with their family because they don't have an economic choice. So this issue really, seeing how badly California dealt with it, seeing that San Francisco takes 867 days to get you a permit back to build a home, all of these situations made my husband and I elated to move to Texas. Now, having moved to Texas, there is also a freedom of thought. Coming with freedom of thought, you also have a freedom to build not only homes, and knock on wood, we keep that freedom, the property right to build what you'd like, but also it's the freedom to build businesses. You'll notice that, this is public information. Gigafactory was built in 1 year. That thing is huge. I don't know if anybody has driven up and down the freeway. That Gigafactory probably would have taken at least 3 to 4 years to even get a permit in California, and that would have been on the good side. So it's really the ability to build businesses, the ability to build homes, and the ability to build the American dream here in Texas, and I really hope that we can preserve that.
I think that's well said, Nicole. Chance, you are the foundation's chief litigator, one of the finest minds I know, and I noticed when Nicole mentioned property rights, your face lit up just a little bit because that is an issue near and dear to your heart. I wonder if you can talk about the property rights issue just a little bit in the Texas context and what it is about that issue that makes Texas special.
Yeah, it's not an accident that it's cheaper to live in Texas than it is to live in California or New York. It's because the Texas Constitution doesn't relegate property rights to the status of poor relation. Many of the states in the country, many federal courts treat property rights as if they're not real rights, even though they're written into the Constitution. But the Texas Supreme Court has held for more than a century that the right to own property and use it in ways that don't harm your neighbors is a fundamental natural right. It pre-exists government, it pre-exists constitutions, and it pre-exists all the city ordinances that want to make it illegal to build things. And so a lot of the litigation that we do is informed by that and trying to protect those rights. Because at the end of the day, if you can't build housing, if you can't build businesses, then people aren't going to have affordable places to live. If you want people to be able to start families and have a yard with their kids and be able to be young professionals or just work ordinary jobs and still live close to the place that they work, they need affordable places to live. And you can't do that when local regulations, federal regulations, state regulations make housing, building affordable housing illegal. And so at TPPF, part of the work that we've done, about 80% of our docket still remains suing federal administrative agencies. But about 20% of our docket is knocking down these sorts of arbitrary restrictions on private property rights that unfortunately we've seen creeping into Texas, undermining the very sort of pro-property framework that's made Texas such a great place to live. We're seeing the same sorts of regulations that we see in places like California and New York starting to pop up in your local zoning boards, and we want to stop that.
Well, and thank you, Chance. And you know, I'm trying to get that 20% case docket measure up. I always send Chance different litigation concepts. So if you guys have any local bad behavior, don't be shy to send them my way. I'll pass them along to Chance. Senator, you know, one of the very good things that I think the movement was able to achieve last session to roll back the progressive agenda at the local level is, of course, something the media coined the Death Star bill. I wonder if I wonder if you might speak about the Death Star bill just a little bit and how that might translate in the future into a bit more affordable local government.
Yeah, that was HB 2127 that I was proud to join authors by Dustin Burrows and Senator Creighton. And it just is a regulatory consistency bill, right? It's not good when you see like what Dallas was doing, prohibiting gas-powered lawnmowers, and I mean, really, you know, with our grid problems, and then, you know, anyway, it's the ridiculous things that you're seeing. Like you also saw, like in New York, where they were banning wood-fired pizza ovens because of the Green New Deal that got in the way of that, you know, greenhouse gas emissions, and some of the ridiculous things that you saw. And really what it came down to was this, is you had a lot of bad government policies that hurt business, that hurt free enterprise, that hurt homeownership, that hurt families, and they were not able to convince the legislature to pass those things. So what did they do? They tried to unlawfully get local government to do it. And that's really what that fixed, is when they're unable to convince the legislature, then maybe it's not a good idea, right? When they know it can't pass through the House and the Senate, they were trying to do a runaround on that and do it on the local level. And that's really what 2127 sought to address, is that inconsistency that we've seen throughout the state with a lot of fields of regulation. It was based on the fields of regulation in commerce. And this is how federalism works, right? The federal government is a creation of the states, and local government is a creation of the states. All power flows from the state at the end of the day, because that is federalism. That's how federalism is supposed to work. So, I mean, this just makes sense, right? I mean, this is how our state government and local government is supposed to work. And that was really the gist of 2127, is we just want a uniform system of lawful regulation, especially of small businesses in our state, where, you know, honestly, the best way, going back to property taxes too, to stimulate the economy and homeownership is letting people keep more of their own money in their own pocket. Well, regulations take money out of their pocket, actually. I mean, you think about it. You own a lawn service company and you're having to get rid of your gas-fired weed eaters and lawnmowers, and that's a regulatory taking, right? So that's exactly what we're hoping to address with that bill.
And of course, this is probably one of the most ambitious conservative pieces of legislation I've ever seen the lawmakers tackle. And of course, once it got passed, cities immediately took the matter to court, alleging that it was unconstitutional. I wonder if you're persuaded by their arguments, or if you think ultimately conservatives will come out on top.
Definitely not persuaded by those arguments. You know, that's a word they throw around a lot, unconstitutional. They do it with school choice all the time. Even though it's a completely groundless and baseless claim, there's no support of that whatsoever. And it's just to tie it up in court and slow it down. I mean, it's lawfare, right? That's what we call it these days. Lawfare against what the legislature is doing. And this is what we're elected to do, right? I mean, I thought we all were supposed to support small businesses in our community. I thought that was the foundation of our communities in Texas exceptionalism, right? Our free enterprise system. But unfortunately, a lot see it like President Barack Obama did, which is, you didn't build that. Remember that? Remember when he said that? Unfortunately, there are a lot of people in government that think that way.
Chance, you know, building on this lawfare idea, one of the other pieces of legislation that the movement was able to achieve victory on was SB 2038, which allows people living outside the city limits to petition to get out of this kind of weird buffer zone that we have here in Texas. I wonder if you could just speak to what cities are saying about SB 2038, and if you find any merit to their argument.
No, I don't find any merit to their argument, but I think that requires some explanation. So who here is familiar with the concept of an extraterritorial jurisdiction? Yeah, who here likes them? Yeah, so I'm going to be preaching to the choir here. But basically, for years, cities were allowed to, as certain cities of a certain size, anything within 5 miles of the exterior portion of the city, they had a certain limited amount of regulatory and fee authority in those areas. Now, these people have chosen not to live in the city. They live outside the city limits. Often, almost always, they don't receive city services. And most importantly, they don't have the right to vote in city elections because they chose not to live in that city. And yet they're still subject to regulation by these cities, by people that they didn't vote for in a city where they chose not to live. So we call these little donuts of disfranchisement. When you look at them on a map, they look like a little donut. And we think this regulation without representation is unconstitutional. I remember Schoolhouse Rock. I remember learning in school that taxation and regulation without representation is what the American Revolution was fought over. But that's what cities have done for years in Texas. Now, what was passed this last session, which was, I think, a great reform, and it's sort of almost a capstone for all the great work we did on involuntary James did on involuntary annexation in previous years, is the idea that people should have a right to vote themselves out of this unconstitutional structure. Now, we also have a lawsuit going on right now at the Texas Supreme Court saying the entire ETJ system is unconstitutional. But at a minimum, people should be able to vote their way out of this system. You shouldn't be stuck permanently in a system where you don't get to vote for the people who regulate your property. And of course, I get a kick out of the lawsuits that were filed because they try and piggyback on some of the constitutional theories that we use to sue cities. And it reminds me of, how many of you have seen The Princess Bride? Right? And they keep saying things like, like Article 1, Section 19 of the Constitution and takings and things like, you keep using that word. I'm not sure that it means what you think it means. And so that's what I think about that litigation.
So you did mention that the foundation has a litigation effort underway as it relates to ETJs. I wonder if you could just mention that, and do you think if we are successful at maybe bringing in large-scale change to the system, will that result in more affordability outside of the city limits? Absolutely.
Absolutely. I mean, the way to make things affordable, it's simple supply and demand, y'all. If you build more housing, housing gets cheaper, right? More importantly than that, people ought to have the right. If I have a 3-acre property out there in the ETJ and I want, to build a house for my mom as she retires and gets older, I should be able to build a granny flat for my mom. It's my property. And what you see so often is that cities in their ETJs are just anti-development. They want to create these buffers where no one can build anything, or they have to go through extensive regulatory red tape or have California-esque waiting times to get things built. And they can do that because no one there gets to vote. It's funny how aggressive cities can be when there's no democratic accountability. And so to the extent that we can get rid of that through litigation or through legislation, not only is it good and true and honest, but it's also going to make a real difference in people's lives. And so that's the reason that we're challenging that process.
Can I add something?
Please.
I was actually at a conference, and there's a Habitat for Humanity CEO who's outside of one of our major cities here in Texas. And her eyes opened really wide. She said, "Did you pass that ETJ bill?" And I said, "No, we didn't do that. That was my friend James at TPPF." But what was happening in her situation was that there were two cities that she was having to pay impact fees for. And so now, after this bill has come up, I've heard from small-time home builders or even bigger developers who are putting out a lot of housing supply, that now when they're talking to cities, they would oftentimes say, okay, well, if you're going to charge these outrageous impact fees, we can look at getting out of the city, because we're trying to bring the cost down of these homes to try to cater to a certain kind of demand or a certain kind of consumer. And that would be the difference. Functionally, that could be the difference between a $400,000 home and a $300,000 home. To give you one example, the similarly sized home in Houston versus Austin is a $100,000 difference. When you take a look at the same kind of home, the amount of money that's put into the build and the land, when you look at all the permit fees and you have to take over 1,400 steps in the city of Austin before you get a permit, that adds $100,000 to the cost of a home. That is functionally the difference between a teacher versus an experienced attorney being able to live in the city of Austin.
Nicole, I wonder if you could just repeat that one point real fast. There's 1,400 steps?
Over 1,400 steps in the city of Austin process, with at least 11 different departments that you have to go through. And it takes, on average, 1 to 2 years to get your permit, which is actually something that James and I worked together on getting third-party review bill passed this last session, which says if a city takes longer than 45 days to get your permit review back, you can go to a certified engineer or certified inspector. At the beginning of this process, this was an idea that I wouldn't have thought that necessarily we would have taken on, but the data is quite abundant. Every 3.5 months delay that a city takes to get you your permits back adds 4 to 5% to the final price tag. So when you do the math, that's 1 to 2 years in Austin. That's a lot of extra costs. And unsurprisingly, there's research that shows 25% of the price of a home is regulations, permit costs, impact fees. If we can slice down a lot of that, that brings a lot of Americans into the fold. And to be clear, this isn't just a City of Austin problem. I think it's easy for us all to point at City of Austin. City of Dallas, 5 to 6 months on average. Now, there are cities that are doing a pretty impressive job. Like Houston takes about 12 days. Houston also has no zoning, and Houston also has a minimum lot size of 1,400 square foot. So it's oftentimes modeled as the premier affordability city across the nation, and that's right in our backyard. So we have the answers on how to do this right, but for some reason we keep persisting in these unaffordable ways throughout the rest of Texas.
Nicole, I don't mean to get you in trouble, so forgive me, but it does seem like there's something of a curiosity where in some of our most progressive communities, that seems to be where the affordability issue is most pronounced. So you have lots of big government urban types who are overtaxing and overregulating, and they are pushing people to the outskirts. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and they disguise these things. I mean, it's the same stuff that you see in California. They disguise this stuff in environmentalism. Well, there was a study that came out that showed when you allow people to build on their own properties, when you allow them to build closer to the cities, people are driving less. So if you really care about environmentalism, there's not a real strong case to be made here. But the same people persist. And those same people, by the way, who are probably some of the most far left, even when laws come on the books to bring on a massive amount of supply to help with the affordability issue, they are going to the courts and suing these laws out of existence. So it's really fascinating to see how some of the far left will go to any length to ensure that other people don't have their property rights. And what's really fascinating is if you go to some of these hearings, opponents of more housing supply will talk about how it's their property right to determine what somebody 1 mile away does with their property. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. At some point, I just had to take a picture of Black's Law Dictionary to show them, clarify what is a property right, what is not a property right. So the other, I think, major issue here, and this is something I was talking to you earlier, James, Americans believe in supply and demand on almost every issue, on commodities, on food, on gas. When it comes to building more homes, we've got a real problem. 30 to 40% of Americans believe not only in just skepticism, but they believe that if more homes are built in their neighborhood, the price of housing will go up. So it's actually not only, oh, I don't know if this policy will work, but actually if we increase the supply, the cost of housing will increase. So we've got a real educational issue to address. And the good news is that we are at the silver lining of being in such a devastating situation on affordability is that there are so many reports that show when you put up 200 units, the surrounding 200 feet immediately goes down by 6% once those units go online. Recently, there's a Texas city that was building a record amount of housing, and what do you know? Within 1 year, the average rent price dropped 7%. This was recently published in The Atlantic. So we've got some work to do, but I think it's very doable work.
And I think that's a great segue. Senator, one of the issues that the legislature broached, or it was actually a suite of different reforms involving minimum lot size requirements, ADU by right. There were some bills to require the sunsetting of certain housing regulations. Unfortunately, the movement wasn't able to get those bills through the House last session. But I feel pretty good about the next legislative session. Do you see a lot of movement on that front next session?
Well, I'll back it up a little bit. So taxpayer-funded lobbyists are causing housing prices to get more and more unaffordable. I mean, that's what they're doing. So the 2038 that we just talked about, that's voter input of getting out of an ETJ. They don't want the voters to have a say in it. They were against that bill. They lobbied against it. Do you remember property tax limits in 2019? Those are voter-approved property tax limits, and they were against that. They don't want you, the taxpayer, to have a say in it. And these are the same lobbyists that are lobbying to hide how much bonds really cost. You notice how just the principal is on the ballot, not the interest? It's because they've lobbied against that, right? They want to hide that from you. And not only that, when they're profiting off of those contracts, they're hiding that too. So I had an ethics bill that would have required more disclosures when they're hiding things in trusts or they're straw man, in a lot of these really anti-free enterprise, anti-private property, you name it, contracts, and they won't disclose that. They lobbied against that too. So they're lobbying to hide how they may be profiting off this as well. I'm bringing it back up to 40,000 feet. Look, this is about our prosperity, right, our future. And we know education is the great equalizer, right? And we can do a lot better in that. And one way we do better is by passing school choice for every single child in this state. Because we need to teach kids the tools that they need to succeed in life and have great academic outcomes, but then also translate that into being able to start a small business, a high-paying career, and then owning, hopefully, a business in the community, a home in the community. Sadly, parents' own tax dollars being used against them on that. And I'll give you a good example here of just how far they've gone. We had a bill that said, look, if a child has been sexually abused or groomed in a public school, then that child gets either public school choice or they get to go to a private school. They lobbied against that, the taxpayer-funded lobbyists. They want to trap that child in that situation that they're being sexually abused and groomed in. And that's the kind of stuff that they stand for. So, I mean, not only are they opposition to the growth of our state, and that we're the beacon of free enterprise, they're opposing parents on the most fundamental level and stopping those better educational outcomes, which, what is that? That's equality of opportunity, right? All of this, with these regulations we're talking about today, is government trying to force equality of outcome, which is socialism. That never works. So what we want and what we all stand for here today is equality of opportunity. And that's what the taxpayer-funded lobbyists are against, with your own tax dollars. It's sad. On every level, it goes on and on. They recently lobbied against chaplains, right, in schools, putting God back in government. They lobbied against that. It goes, I can go into every election integrity. They lobbied against citizenship verification, right? They've lobbied against every single reform that we need, including one of them was stopping voter suppression, right? They lobbied against that, where we saw it in Harris County, where they denied ballot paper to Republican precincts. They lobbied against that. They spent over $70 million of your taxpayer money last session against you and what you believe in. So that's why it's so important to stop taxpayer-funded lobbying in Texas.
Well, and I think you're right to highlight the school choice effort. Obviously, probably the legislature's number one aspirational goal next session. I just want to pull on that thread for just a moment. When you consider what are the major impediments to achieving school choice, I think it's very clear that taxpayer-funded lobbying is the biggest obstacle. And then within that sphere, of course, we have to talk about the Texas Association of School Boards, or TASB. And one of my frustrations with TASB is we don't even really know how much money TASB is getting, because even though they largely, or mostly, if not fully, operate on public money, we have no idea how much money that is or where those dollars are going. And I wonder if it's not time to maybe audit TASB and figure out where our money is going.
And we don't know. It's the same with Texas Municipal League. It's the same with Texas Association of Counties. The primary way that they make money is they provide the single bid, no bid risk pool insurance for counties, cities, and school districts. And then they launder that money into the lobbyists that are against you and conservative values and against the prosperity and future of the state and the conservative values too. Like TASB's lobbyist was, in 2021 when we passed the Save Girl Sports, so K-12, stopping boys from playing girl sports, was in the gallery with rainbow socks on saying, stop this bill, and hoping it failed. And at that point it did, and we later passed it in the special session. But I mean, these are the kind of things that you're seeing, like Texas Municipal League, that is lobbying against everything we've talked about here today. They put on a presentation called Shaking the Money Tree. You're the money tree. I want to hold you up by your ankles and shake the last coins out of your pocket here, right? How to increase fees. Well, I'm sorry, but if government imposes something and calls it a fee, it's a tax. That's not a fee. If government imposes it, it is a tax, period, the end, like these impact fees that Nicole just talked about. That's a tax. It needs to be called a tax. It's not anything else. So that's the kind of thing that we're up against. Like TASB, they have critical race theory in their statement of beliefs. This is supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in their statement of beliefs, they invited the ACLU in to train school districts and to advance Joe Biden's agenda on transgender students. Literally invited the ACLU in to do that. Of course, they supported the national taxpayer-funded lobby group, NASB, that wanted to label parents domestic terrorists and have the National Guard come in to stop you from speaking out in your school board, and label you, a terrorist that needed to be stopped. So that's the kind of thing that we're up against.
Nicole, you and I, of course, spent a lot of time in committee trying to advance legislation last session, faced our fair share of taxpayer-funded lobbyists, but we also face a lot of NIMBYs too, right? These are folks who are very much wedded to the status quo. I wonder if we might just take a moment to explore some of their arguments as it relates to the minimum lot size legislation, the ADU by rights, this idea, going back to your earlier point about, some people think they have property rights over your property. How do we get around a lot of these concerns in the next legislative session and achieve success?
It's a great question. I think in trying to answer that, we got one major bill passed. TPPF got a few major land use bill passed. We almost got a second bill passed to give folks the right to build a granny flat, like Chance was saying, in their own backyard if they want to help, a student who's maybe has an internship right out of college and can't afford to pay for an entire apartment or a mortgage on a home. That got 2 votes away from passing and going to the governor's desk. We actually never had issues with the Senate. Things sailed through the Senate. It was always the House that there was issues. And on that bill, it was unfortunate because John Bryant stood up, made the issue about short-term rentals. We made sure that we actually put a line in the bill saying this has nothing to do with short-term rentals. This is a completely separate bill. It's about property rights and being able to have the property right to build a granny flat in your own backyard. John Bryant devolved the whole issue into short-term rentals, which you'll oftentimes notice that when people are trying to oppose increased housing, they bring up this risk that somehow there's going to be that more housing would go directly to short-term rentals. We're dealing with more housing, plain and simple. And so it's interesting that the opponents continue to try to conflate the issue. But what I found the most fascinating was that when John Bryant delivered his speech after he tried to point of order the bill, which is something that he seems to have found his entire mission to point of order decent bills in the House, he then went on about a week later to speak with Axios Dallas about why the state wasn't doing enough on housing affordability. It was comical. And the reporter, you could tell the reporter who was interviewing him was a little intimidated, but said, there was a granny flat bill or an accessory dwelling unit bill that recently died in the House. And he just pivoted to, we need more subsidies. But the fact is that there is no way we're going to subsidize our way out of this affordability crisis. It needs a multifaceted solution, and we need to allow small businesses and homeowners to build towards the demand. And what you found is the city of Austin, that's the most expensive, has held back on that. So I think that really it's the awareness about supply and demand. And I think that these folks are willing to throw anything to distract from the issue. So it's keeping it about affordability and not let this rumor mongering sort of get away from them. The other thing is I think that what we have on our side is that it's really unfortunate how devastating our housing prices have gone. But the silver side of the silver lining, and we have this great piece of data that's on all of the different chairs today, where TPPF worked with a group to do a study to show over 83% of Texans think that we're in a housing affordability crisis. That's a problem, and that's not common. And how many people here have heard of somebody who either had to move out of their city because they couldn't afford it, or their kid doesn't know what they're going to do, thinking about moving to another state or another city far away from their family? Raise your hand if you know of a situation like this. And it's only going to get worse if we don't do stuff like this. And it's the John Bryants of the world that are stopping the real progress and the real solutions to solve these issues. I want to bring up one other thing here, which I think when we talk about housing affordability, a lot of folks don't typically associate it with businesses. But the fact of the matter is Hoover Institute did a study on why California businesses were leaving. And there's probably a multitude of reasons, but the top reason was taxes. which the Texas legislature has done a lot of positive things. I know TPPF has been a part of that. Number 2 reason and number 3 reason was housing costs and cost of living. Because at the end of the day, people don't want to live in San Francisco where it's $1.3 million home price when they're getting paid $60,000 for an assistant or mid-level manager job. The economics of that don't work. So in that situation, a small business or a business could raise the salary, but the question is, do the revenues map up with the salaries that they're trying to pay? And the data shows that that is one of the main impetuses why hundreds of businesses are moving from California to both Texas and Florida. So this is not just a feel-good issue. You know, Governor Abbott has done a phenomenal job at bringing in a lot of those jobs. But what I worry is that if we don't continue to match those jobs with strong housing growth, where will the economy be? And can we continue growing, or are we going to go down the trajectory of an overly regulated, stagnating California?
All very good points, and I just want to go back for just a moment, because when 2 of your legislative proposals in particular, ADU and minimum lot size reform, unfortunately went down in the House, one thing that I noticed was the Austin delegation in particular seemed to be rather celebratory. Yeah. And then shortly thereafter, there seemed to be kind of this groundswell of criticism on the left that really instigated some intra-party friction. And I wonder, did you notice that same thing? And do you think it changes the dynamic moving forward?
Absolutely, and we had at least 2 Democratic legislators who, after getting multiple Twitter attacks from students at UT Austin for voting the way that they did, which was against these bills, sort of recanted privately to people that I know that should the bill come up the next morning, they're definitely going to vote yes. The bill didn't come up the next morning. But I don't think it's a coincidence that, you know, the young Republicans and some of the leadership there are tweeting about hosting a housing panel, and students at UT Austin are also advocating deeply for the same issue. This is the issue of the next generation, and the legislators and the folks who sort of rally behind this issue, I think, are going to be able to rally the base in a way that's really positive. I'd also like to point out on this same issue, you know, the governor of Utah, the governor of Utah, as well as the governor of Montana, both strong conservatives, strong Republicans, are using this same issue, housing affordability, deregulating to levels of affordability, as one of their main rallying points, not only in getting legislation passed, but also using it in their re-election campaign. So, you know, I think this really is where the future is, especially for our young people, a lot of your grandkids, a lot of your kids who are struggling to figure out not only how they're going to rent, but what is the American dream of homeownership ever going to be accessible to them?
Please, Chance.
And I don't know if we're running out of time, but I was just going to say to that point, I've always expected on property rights issues to get pushback from the left. I mean, zoning was a progressive concept. I like to remind some of my friends on the left when they talk about housing affordability, it was the progressive era that gave us all of these zoning regulations. The first zoning regulation that was ever passed was to keep black people out of neighborhoods in Buchanan versus Worley. And it was a libertarian pro-property rights Supreme Court that struck that down 30 years before Brown versus Board of Education. But if we want to solve this problem, now that we have some people on the left that are coming on board, that they care because they can't afford homes, some of the NIMBYism on the right has to stop. We have to remind people that property rights aren't just, you know, I want people to build, but not in my backyard. I want people to have their property rights, but not in my backyard. I don't want my neighborhood to change. We have to remind people that if someone owns that lot next to you, that's theirs. We have to distinguish between what we want and what we own, right? And if someone else owns it, that means it belongs to them. And that's a fundamental conservative value that we have to remind, I think, sometimes once people get vested in their own preferences, that your principles have to apply in your backyard as well as they do out in other people's neighborhoods as well.
And just to add a little bit of a caveat to that, you know, we're very much in favor of rolling back government regulation of all these various land use items. But we also remind people that there are voluntary arrangements that can be entered into so as to preserve the characteristic of a neighborhood.
That's right. And, you know, you're going to pay a little bit extra whenever you have an HOA, right? You're going to buy into a deed-restricted neighborhood, and you're going to pay a little bit for that. And that's fine. Contracts are fine. But I think what people have come to believe now is that they can treat their city council as if it was their HOA. Or they could treat Congress or the federal regulatory agency as if it were their HOA and regulate other people's property rights who didn't agree to that, who didn't buy into that. And I don't think that's right. But I think it's important to remind people how property rights work. There you go.
And I want to see if I can put a smile on Christian's face real fast. Chance, you guys use a case law that's rooted in something called SPAN. Can you talk just a little bit about SPAN and how that animates a lot of the foundation's litigation work?
Okay, so brief history. So for most of American history, property rights were considered fundamental rights at both the state and federal level. You may recall I told you about a case just a second ago, Buchanan versus Worley in 1918. And that was the case that struck down the first ever zoning ordinance, which was a race-based zoning ordinance. And the court held that it was an unconstitutional ordinance, not because it violated the Equal Protection Clause, but because cities only had the right to regulate property for nuisance. And having a man from a different race buy a home next to you was not a nuisance at common law, and therefore the city couldn't regulate for that reason. People have the right to own property. The progressive movement wanted to move away from that. They wanted to micromanage the growth of cities. And you see a case comes down as the court becomes more progressive, moving into the FDR era, you get a case called Euclid. And Euclid was a case where they decided they wanted to zone anyway based on what was called neighborhood character. This is where the term comes from. It's a progressive term. And it was designed primarily to backdoor overturn Buchanan versus Worley. And so you could micromanage building materials, because guess what? If you can make the building materials more expensive for all the houses that could be built somewhere, guess who can't live there anymore? Right? And that's how we get modern zoning. Now, the state of Texas, to its credit, in a case called Spann versus Dallas, says, in Texas, the right to own property is a fundamental right. Cities can only regulate for nuisance. So you can't put a dynamite factory next to a hospital. You can't put a strip club next to a school. You can't, put a slaughterhouse next to a sanitary facility. But you can't tell people in Texas what color they paint their shutters. Okay, that is not permissible under the Texas Constitution. And immediately after Spann, there was a pushback that said, well, the federal Supreme Court said under the United States Constitution that neighborhood character's fine. The Texas Supreme Court the following year said, nope. When it comes to the Texas Constitution, we still follow Spann. Now, because people don't care about federalism, they largely forgot about this case for about 50 years. Until in 2019, we got the Third Court of Appeals in Austin to cite it as authority in Zatari versus the City of Austin. And then 2 years later, we got 4 justices of the Texas Supreme Court to cite it in a concurring opinion that said Spann has never been overturned in Texas, and the right to own property is, in fact, a fundamental right. So, that's Spann. So Christian can now be happy about that, but that's how Spann works.
All right, we're going to go to Q&A, so get your questions ready. Looks like we got quite a few here. If we can go to this young lady right here in the front first.
Thank you. Senator Middleton, I think you know that there's no bigger supporter of banning taxpayer-funded lobbyists than me, and I assume you will file that bill again in 25, and I will support it. But my question is about what you said about school choice, and that we need to pass school choice for, I believe you said, every single student in Texas. However, the bills that I've seen come forth so far for school choice do not fund every single student. There's a finite amount of dollars allocated to a finite number of students. So if we're going to pass school choice and call it universal for every single student, how do we fund every single student?
Well, I've always supported universal school choice. Every parent should be treated equally, every mom and dad. Every child deserves an opportunity that's best for them. And when we say universal, we mean everyone's eligible, right? So that's what that means. And as we've seen in other states, there's only like a 1 or 2% exit rate from traditional public schools, and it sort of caps out once you get to about 80% remain. in ISDs, 85%. Not everyone takes advantage of it, but it's not up to us to decide why or why not, because all school choice is this. It's real simple. The final say in a child's education should be the parents and not government. That's what it is. And we're just letting moms and dads decide how that money's spent. So yes, everyone needs to be eligible. I've always supported that. We've got to get that done. I think what you're going to see, especially in the House, is a lot better bill next session, because we're going to have a lot more conservative Texas House. We did great in March 5th. And I'm hoping we're going to do great in the runoffs here. I think so. And the first bill I always file every single session is the ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying. And I will continue to do that until we get it done for this state, because that is the opposition to the liberty that I'm talking about. Our values, our fundamental Texas values, are being fought against by Austin lobbyist middleman between us and local government that's opposing what we believe in, opposing the very things that have made this state great, including parents' God-given rights. They oppose parents' God-given rights to decide what's best for their child. And I mean, we don't send lobbyists to, there's a lot of school districts, counties, 254, a lot of cities, over 1,000. The state doesn't send lobbyists to them because it's hard to keep up with. That's our job as legislators to know that. There doesn't need to be someone in the middle between city councilman, school board member, county commissioner, county judge, and your state legislator. That is our job. You know, and you hear a lot of them say, oh, we're the real experts are here in Austin, right? You know, okay. So the County Judge and Commissioners Association of Texas lobbyist, he gives to Act Blue. How's that represent rural Texas? Is that a good representation? I don't think so. So no, they're a terrible representation, and they're actually fighting the values and lying to the people that they say they represent. I see it all the time. They lie constantly to protect their paycheck, because that's really what it comes down to, is that bill would defund those liberal Austin lobbyists, and it will increase the voice of our constituents at home, because they're not having to fight against what they believe in with their own tax dollars. It will increase their voice in your state government by getting rid of taxpayer-funded lobbying. So it increases local control and local voices. So that's why it's so important to get done. But I'm 100% with you. We need every parent, every child to be eligible for school choice. And you know, there were a lot more lies about that this session, where it was $500 million and it was going to defund. Okay. Well, we spend $93.6 billion, so let's do a little remedial math lesson. 500 million over 93.6 billion is about 0.5%. That's not defunding anybody, you know, but that's the kind of thing that you heard, unfortunately, when the bill was going through the House this past session. So,
well, I think that's right on target. You get rid of taxpayer-funded lobbying, and that will result in better legislation, and better legislation will help us keep Texas, Texas. Yes, sir.
Hi, Michael Hewitt from Dallas. Some of you talked about being California economic refugees. What are the panel's thoughts, if any, on the issue of people coming from states like California and voting for the same liberal economic policies that have ruined California here in Texas? Are you concerned about that, and what can be done about that?
I could send James back if you want.
So
TML would appreciate it.
what's interesting is I think that there's, actually you go ahead. No. I think there's been some data that showed the people coming here are actually voting R more than Texans themselves. Additionally, I was looking at a Texas 2036 poll, and I was looking for, you know, why are people thinking about leaving? Unsurprisingly, housing affordability. But what was the top reason more than housing affordability? Can you guess? It was politics. So I think you're finding a situation where people are going to California who think like that, and people are coming here who think like this. You know, we'll find out in a few years here whether I'm right or wrong, but I think it's a reverse phenomena than what people were fearful of.
I think that's right. I think there is something of a self-sorting mechanism in place, and if I could offer just one quick thought on that, you know, while we have the high ground, I think it's important that we make structural changes to the system in such a way that maintains our small government ethos. What does that look like? Well, let's put in the Texas Constitution a local expenditure limit that requires cities and counties to limit spending growth. That way we maintain some sense of reason at the local level. And I've got my microphone guy running around here somewhere. Oh, there he is.
Yeah.
If we can go to this young lady right here in the front.
Hi, there is statistics, and they said do not, and we had a big meeting, and don't worry about anybody coming from California because they're all conservative. The ones you have to worry about is the illegals coming in, which expands the population, which means you have more representatives, and those representatives are the ones you have to worry about. But the ones coming from California, you do not. My question is, the building. If you're building the homes, what is happening in the area that I live in, which is Montgomery, which they are really hard trying to turn us blue, the flooding that we are experiencing because of what they're building in our areas. Our older homes never flooded. Now they're building all of these, what do you call them? All these homes in different types of areas, and what's happening is the water is running down and they're flooding all of these homes, and people are spending tons of money trying to get their, we tried to go to Commissioner Court, but they didn't do anything. Not only that, but they used to have public, we could have us talk at the end, and they canceled that. So we are fighting almost a losing battle. We don't even know what to do. So any help, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I am a strong believer in making sure that we're not putting people at risk of flooding, and we're not putting people at risk of public safety. So I think that there should be every consideration taken towards that. I'm sorry about your situation.
Well, and I had something on that. So that's something we worked on in 2019 after Harvey, and the problem that we saw all the time was that they didn't have a regional flood plan or drainage study. And you'd have basically like a 2-inch pipe going in a 4-inch pipe going back in a 2-inch pipe. Well, that's not going to work, right? I mean, and so we saw that pretty often in counties. So now that we require them all to work together, every political subdivision has to come up with a plan that works for the whole watershed, not just their little section of the watershed. And that was the issue that we ran into after Harvey. And it's got to be actual, what we call, I guess, science-based, with the Flood Infrastructure Fund is what we passed back then. So that's really important that they integrate it into that regional plan for the whole watershed, where they're not making that bad decision. Just, we're going to be responsible for our part, and either that's going to pile up water on someone downstream because it's going to increase the volume of velocity to the person that hadn't done anything about it, the city, county, whatever, downstream. So that was a really important change in 2019 that we need to hold them to it.
And I'll give 15 seconds. So one of the reasons you end up with this problem is traditionally when you built, that you would have a mitigation permit that would say that, like, you have to, if you're going to do impervious cover, you have to have a culvert to do runoff. And that's fine. You don't have the right to dump water on someone else's property, and that sort of mitigation permit's fine. But what cities do instead, because it was never, for them, it's not really about mitigation, they don't care, is they use those permitting fees, instead of for mitigation, they use it as a slush fund for the city. So instead they say, if you want to build anything, you got to pay $1,500 in mitigation, but then it doesn't build any culverts, it doesn't build any drainage runoff, because it's not tied to that. And so, one of the ways to stop that sort of stuff is to ensure that whenever you have mitigation fees or mitigation or impact requirements for building, that those things actually be tied to the impact of that development. You shouldn't be getting, a mitigation impact fee that doesn't build any culverts or doesn't build any runoff protection, that just pads the coffers of the city. And we've seen that way too much.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the affordable housing issue, and that does affect all of us. It is even affecting those of us who have had our homes for almost 20 years because, and I do believe I heard the Lieutenant Governor say yesterday, and I'm excited, and hopefully it will happen, is that our goal, end-all goal, is to eliminate property taxes altogether, but we all know, realistically, how long is it going to take for us to get there? So until we get there, I will give it. I know we're throwing a lot of shade at California, and rightfully so. But something that I do believe they did right, in my opinion, years ago, was come in with Proposition 13. Is there a way that we can legislate to end inflating our home values to be taxed on futuristic values? Unlike in California, I believe if you buy a house for $100,000, you can own it for 20 years, and you're going to pay taxes on $100,000, not $1 million. We did not buy or build $1 million house, but we're paying taxes on $1 million house, and that was 18 years ago. Now it's worth so. That is not only, yes, you can get into maybe owning a home, but how do you stay in that at a fixed income? So.
Oh, I grieves me to say that California never did anything right, but really does, But that was when they were Republican. It wasn't long after Reagan was governor that they passed that, so there's the asterisk on that. It wasn't certainly not. They tried to undo it, by the way, not that long ago, too. But it encourages long-term home ownership, right? It's something I've always supported. I've worked with our local tax assessor, Cheryl Johnson in Galveston County. Price paid, that's what it is. Price paid. And you don't have to disclose, what you paid for it, but if you don't, they can set the value for it, right? And it's also potentially a way to get rid of the Central Appraisal District, which we're spending $600 or $700 million a year for all the counties on that. So, that'd be a huge taxpayer savings as well. I'm for all of the above. Whatever lowers your tax bill, I don't care what it is, we need to do it, because this is a basic homeownership affordability issue. I've knocked on many, many doors where, they said they can't afford to live in the home that they raised their children in, and that's wrong. No one should be faced with that decision ever, So we have got to do more property tax relief to make sure that we're protecting private property rights. It's one of the best ways to do that.
If we can go to this gentleman right here in the burnt orange, Hookham.
Can I add something just really quick on this one? I think it's an important point that you bring up. There's Mercatus just did a study that they released a few months ago, and they actually compared when they reduced their minimum lot size from 5,000 square foot to 1,400 square foot in the inner loop of the freeway there, and they compared it to outside of the freeway. What they found was that the taxes per the taxes didn't functionally change, and I'm happy to send that study to you, but it did surprise me to see that there wasn't a distinct difference between the taxes on the land that went up, but that did assuage some fears about taxes going up when people can build more on a set piece of land.
Fair point. Yes, sir.
First up, y'all mentioned the article that came out in the Atlantic just in the last couple days. I actually, not intentionally, but I actually read that article about an hour before this panel started, and I just want to plug it as well. It's really very, very well done. My question is, and James, obviously you know this, I've been on the kick of a lot of this stuff for the better part of a decade. And going back to at least 2016 and some of the local elections here in Austin. But I think back to 2016, 2017, 18, 19, that whole era, and on a lot of this stuff, the regulatory consistency, land use and housing affordability, taxpayer-funded lobbying, all of that stuff, you would explain to people, A, it's bad economics because it raises cost, and B, it's bad politics because all of this stuff acts as a front for political patronage by all of the worst people out there. And yet you would talk about this till it was blue in the face, and basically, and I know you remember that, you get blank stares back from people. It was not even computing. And now, the last few years, it just seems like things that, the original preemption bill in 2019 died on some very, very frivolous arguments, but then all of a sudden we came back in 2023 and passed something that's about a zillion times better. And you just see things happening now, and you see conversations moving, and what changed the political dynamic? Why are all of a sudden things that just 3-4 years ago seemed like pipe dreams actually seeming viable now?
It's a good question. Senator, any thoughts on how?
People are waking up to their own dollars being used against them, tax dollars. I think that's the biggest thing. You've seen it happen in a lot of cities in the news, like with where Joe Biden wanted to get rid of your natural gas stove. Okay, it was crawfish season. You're going to do a crawfish boil on an electric stove? Really? I mean, ridiculous, stupid things like that, where they've taken it so far, right? And it's gotten so extreme where they're taking away not just your tax dollars, but a lot of your private property freedoms. They're fighting against your values, all the things that are happening where it's really woken people up, I think is the long and the short of it. And what that means is I think we're going to have a lot of conservative successes next session. So
I think the short version of it is, not everybody's involved in industries, but everybody gets groceries. And everybody pays rent or pays a mortgage, and everybody has property taxes. So at some level, even if you're renting, you're paying property taxes whether you know it or not. And I think the bad policy is finally, I think to a certain extent, coming home to roost to everyone. And they can't lie about it anymore. They can't. People know what their grocery bill looks like. So
Actually, I stopped looking. I have 5 kids, so. Yes, sir.
Howdy, my name is Joel Castro from Alvin, Texas. One of the things that I've kind of noticed when you're talking is a lot of these issues pertain to city councils. City councils have kind of become the problem. We can create legislation all day long to reduce the power from city councils, but we know that TML is always going to find loopholes, and they kind of have a monopoly when it comes to talking to council members all across the state of Texas. One thing that I've come to find out when talking to council members from everywhere is there's a lack of education when it comes to knowing good freedom-oriented conservative policies that they can implement, whether it's increasing homestead exemption, the bad things about CO, certificate of obligations, how that can affect the taxpayers. I've come to find out that a lot of council members they claim to be Republican and they want to be conservative. Those things they campaign on being taxpayer friendly, but at the end of the day, their education they're getting is not that way, and so they seem to be they're getting the wrong sort of education. What can we do to combat that, to make sure that when it comes to city councils, that they vote right ways and they're able to hold bureaucrats hold bureaucrats accountable instead of becoming a rubber stamp, and educate them on good policies?
they can all call James Quintero. His email address is, I think.
Great question.
No, I think that's a good example. I mean, look, what are you called now? You're not the Center for Local Governments anymore.
Taxpayer protection.
Taxpayer protection. There's a ton of good research out there that James and his folks have done. Nicole Nozick's organization does a lot of really good work on this. There's a whole body of information available to city council members. They can always, they can reach out to TPPF. I can tell them how to not get sued. And I think just to actually care about it, to actually care about on the front end whether this is something that they can constitutionally do. I think a lot of people in politics don't ask that question first. They don't ask, is this something the government should even be doing in the first place? And there should always be someone in the room, in the city council, that's going to go, hey, can we actually do this? Is this something that we can constitutionally do? Is this something that's going to help people or hurt people? And then the other thing, too, is I think one of the problems that we've had with local governments is because of a lot of the immunity doctrines that are built in through legislation, they never have any skin in the game. So I'll give you an example. We litigate cases on property rights issues. Sometimes it'll be an exaction fee or something that's $25,000. And that's a lot of money. But for a lot of businesses, they'll just pay that to the government because it's going to cost $450,000 to litigate it. And under existing immunity doctrines, once you've won, you know how much you get in damages? All the court can do is tell the city to stop violating your rights, right? So if you're a city attorney and you're advising the city council about whether or not to do something that's going to drive up property values or might violate the Constitution or give these arbitrary fees against property, what are you going to advise them to do? Well, let's just go ahead and try it, because for every one person that runs it up 5 years through $400,000 in fees, we're going to be able to shake down half the population for these fees before it's ever challenged. And the worst thing that can happen to you is that the court tells you to stop doing it. And that, I think, until you change that, you won't be able to change the lawlessness of the cities.
Well, and I would add one thing there on like Texas Municipal League, Texas Association of Counties, Texas Association of School Boards. They're literally indoctrinating our local elected officials.
Yep.
And they were smart in that they got it in the law that county judges, commissioners have to go to training. Well, guess who provides the only training? TAC. School board members have to go to training. Well, guess who provides the only training on that right now? TASB, right? So we need, first of all, to abolish that, but to create alternatives. And there is one now on school boards called TE, Texans for Excellence in Education. We actually have someone on the front row here that started one for conservative teachers, innovative teachers of Texas, to get away from some of the more left-wing teachers associations. So we need to start those conservative organizations as well. But at the end of the day, that training should not be required by law. Your training is what you said you were going to do and being accountable directly to your voters. You shouldn't be accountable directly to a taxpayer-funded lobby group in Austin. You need to be accountable to the voters that put you in office and what you said you were going to do when you ran for office.
I think we got time for one more. Let's go to this tall gentleman with the red hair.
I'm Vance again from Round Rock, Texas, and I just want to go on the record that I'm for James staying in Texas. He is repopulating conservatives, so it's true. Yeah, I'm done. So as far as affordability goes, one thing that we need to take account of is the ultimate burden of government is how much it spends. And local governments are spending way too much. One thing that I think we really need to do in Texas is to expand our constitutional spending limit to include local governments like they have in Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And any surplus money that they get, whether it's the state or the local government, should be going to reduce property taxes. That's how we can eliminate property taxes in about a decade. So I wonder what the thoughts are on local government spending limits. Not the SB 2 of 2019, because that only includes existing property. That does not limit spending. We need spending limits at the local level. What do you think?
100% agree. We did it ourselves last session, or session before last in the legislature, population times inflation. The state cannot spend more. I'd like it to be plus instead of times, by the way, but you know, it's a cap and it's a meaningful cap and we need to keep it. But you know, that's the kind of thing that we need. Another thing that we need to do is we need to ask for a reimbursement from the federal government for us doing their job for them at the border and make sure all $12 billion of that goes to property tax relief. And we add that to the 20, and man, we've gone a long way in eliminating a huge portion of your property tax bill. But look, I mean, we've got a spending cap on state government, so why not local government? I mean, it's all the same taxpayer money. We're all paying for all of this. You know, government has no money. It's all taxpayer money. So it should be the same for both.
Guys, the bad news is we're out of time. The good news is I think most of us are sticking around for lunch. So if you have a question lingering, please feel free to come up and find us during the rest of the program. Thank you all very much for being here, and help me thank these fine folks for being here as well.